CBS News Justice reporter Paula Reid is in Washington. So, Paula, you read through this decision. What can you tell us?
Elaine, the judges had to consider a few different things before they made their decision. First, they had to decide whether or not it's likely that the government will ultimately prevail on the question of whether or not this law is constitutional. Of course, what they're arguing about right now is whether or not the government can enforce this policy, while the courts argue about whether or not this is constitutional. The Department of Justice said, wait a second, you put our policy on hold? No, we should be allowed to enforce this until a court says it is unconstitutional. But this circuit, the Ninth Circuit, they have some skepticism about whether or not the White House will ultimately prevail. They also needed to look at whether or not this was in the public interest and the chaos that could potentially be created if they once again reinstate this travel ban. But ultimately, they decided that the president's policy, the so-called travel ban, will remain on hold until there is a final decision on whether or not this policy was actually constitutional.
Well, Paula, with the lower court's ruling being upheld, the president has already tweeted, "See you in court. The security of our nation is at stake." So what comes next?
They have a few different options. And of course, he wasn't specific about what court, which court, but the Supreme Court is one option. The government can appeal this decision to the Supreme Court and ask them to allow the government to enforce this policy while the courts decide whether or not it's constitutional. And that could take several months. Now, the other option is to just let this decision stand, go back down to the lower court and start fighting this on the merits. So inevitably, they were going to wind up in court. It's not clear specifically which court the president was referring to, or if that means definitively that they're going to try to take this to the Supreme Court.
And so what happens if there is no new justice brought in, if it's a 4-4 court?
Well, if it's a 4-4 court, which it would be for this initial phase, they will have to make a decision. It's not clear how they would rule, because this is really a very procedural, sort of in the weeds question about a temporary restraining order. It would be unlikely that they would upend the decisions from the lower court and the Ninth Circuit and reinstate the travel ban. There seems to be some pretty strong arguments that that would create a lot of chaos and that we should just hold off until the courts decide whether or not it's constitutional. Now, Elaine, if a 4-4 court splits, that means the Ninth Circuit's decision is the decision. So that's what happens when a 4-4 court splits. It's the lower court that becomes the decision. So it's not clear that even if they take this to the Supreme Court, Elaine, that they would really get any sort of a different outcome. But it's just really important to note, this is not the final word on this policy. This is just right now an argument about whether or not the government should be able to enforce this until there's a final word, likely from the Supreme Court in several months, about whether or not what President Trump did was constitutional.
All right, so Paula, you say in several months potentially, if in fact the government decides to go that route, would it not be faster to take back the executive order, fix it so that it would pass legal muster, and then reissue it if in fact safety is of paramount concern?
Yes, redrafting it would probably be the most surefire way to get this upheld at the last level, the Supreme Court. When you look at this, and when the justices and the judges rather have asked questions about this policy, it is clear that there are some concerns as to why there weren't more carve-outs. Specifically, the judge at the district level asked, he said, well, why is this just so broadly applicable to people? Why didn't you have carve-outs? For example, why didn't you have exceptions for people who had green cards? Why didn't you have exceptions for people who got visas, who got those visas because they helped the United States? There's a lot of questions about whether or not this was a carefully crafted policy with national security in mind, or, as the states that have challenged it argue, whether or not it is something closer to a Muslim ban. Elaine, to answer your question, yes. If I was advising the president, I would say, hey, if you want to win at the Supreme Court, you might want to take this one back to the drawing table, write in a few exceptions, make it a little more narrowly tailored, so you can bolster your argument that this was just about national security. Because right now, your adversaries have a lot to go on, a lot of ammo, and the judges seem to be buying it. This wasn't just about national security and potentially is discriminating against people solely based on their religion.
All right, we will watch to see what the Trump administration does. Paula Reid, thanks so much. Appreciate it.